Welcome, everybody. My name is Rabbi Pinney Herman. I'm a Rabbi Emeritus of Congregation Shari Israel Chabad in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was there for 30 years and now make my residence in Miami Beach, Florida. Throughout this talk, you can ask questions through the chat or the Q&A features. If you want to keep your questions totally anonymous, you can ask via the Ask Anonymous question. The link will be in the chat. This event is brought to the community by Adei Ad, Crown Heights Jewish Community Council, Shalom Task Force, an association of Crown Heights Shuls. The event is part of a series of workshops and education that has been funded by a grant from New York City Council's Domestic Violence Empowerment Initiative to Crown Heights Jewish Community Council on the recommendation of Council Member Matthew Eugene. Thank you to Dvorah Krasniansky of Adei Ad for spearheading this project and all of the other work she does on behalf of the community in areas of Shidduchim, marriage, and Shalom Bayis. There are many resources that you can find at www.adeiad, that's ADAIAD.org. Also want to thank Rabbi Lazer Afton of Association of Crown Heights Shuls for the encouragement and support of this project. This is the second in the first supporters series about Shalom Bayis issues. Upcoming topics will be advertised as we get closer, and they include how to respond when someone approaches you about a spouse with an addiction, spouse has mental illness, internet use, pornography issues and related issues in marriage, and general Shalom Bayis issues. In case you did not see it, the first talk was about domestic abuse. And again, you can get the recording through adeiad.org. To sign up to hear about upcoming events, drop your email in the chat or in the Q&A. Okay, that's the housekeeping. I am delighted to introduce to you today, or this evening, Rabbi Simcha Feuerman, licensed clinical social worker, Director of Operations and Strategic Development.
Oh, no, that's an old, hold on. That's an old title. For the last 2 years, have not been connected to that organization, other than in my heart. I'm in exclusively in private practice.
We'll skip that first sentence then.
Sorry about that.
A clinician in private practice, specializing in high conflict couples and families, and also has a blog, Psychology from the Daf, taking a lesson from Daf Yomi and applying the psychological component to it. He has offices in New York and in Boca Raton, Florida. Tonight's discussion will be when someone approaches you about betrayal in marriage. So before we begin, I just want to make sure that we're clear what we are not talking about tonight, and those are the halachic issues associated with betrayal in marriage. That is something you have to speak to your Rav about, and if God forbid you are in that situation, obviously to have a good therapist and someone hopefully who can work together with your Rav to guide you in this. So Simcha, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Let's start with the title. Could you define betrayal for us?
Well, betrayal is some kind of dramatic breach of trust, so much so that whatever was considered implicit or explicit in the contract, in this case, we would say the contract of marriage has been terribly broken and violated. If you lied to your spouse and told me you took out the garbage and you didn't take out the garbage, that's not a betrayal, because one would think that the very validity of the marriage doesn't hang on that. But there are forms of, and we're not only talking about infidelity, there are forms of betrayals and breaches of trust that are so dramatic that it's almost impossible, at least immediately, to come back to some kind of equilibrium or homeostasis. That it's so disruptive that the trust in everything then would be brought into question.
Could you give some examples of that?
Well, obviously, the most common one that is on people's minds would be, actual straight out sexual infidelity, some kind of adulterous affair. Clearly, that's a major one, and that's as old as time itself. But there are many other examples as well, which I could list if you'd like, and by no means it's not exhaustive. There's financial betrayals, and those can take different forms. There could be somebody spending money that's really considered the domain of both spouses, and investing in some crazy investment. Let's say it doesn't have a happy ending, although technically speaking, even if it did and they made a lot of money, it still would be a betrayal to take that risk with somebody else's money. But classically, something like that might happen. You wouldn't understand. I had to take the risk because you would just get in my way, something like that. But also, there are people today, and I think much more common today because of people's relationship with money and debt and materialism. There are a lot of people that come into a marriage not only without savings, but sometimes with significant credit card debt. And I think when that's not disclosed in advance, especially if it's a large amount, I think that is experienced, rightfully so, as a betrayal. And then there are what I'd like to call like Shidduch betrayals. There are people that have kept secrets about certain aspects of themselves that really the other person would have wanted to know. And some of these things are judgment calls, but in the end, you kind of know it when you see it. And those have a lot of bad effects. To start out with, obviously, there's a sense of betrayal itself, but then there are much more subtle issues. For example, a relatively minor but chronic medical issue that normally a person might independently, having known about it, might have, for all the person's qualities, chosen to marry that person anyway, and happily so. But being deprived of the choice creates a kind of rage and resentment and mistrust. And even more so when that problem continues to assert itself or reassert itself. Maybe someone had cancer, God forbid, when they were 10 and was in remission, and it comes back when they're 35, and that was never told. Maybe the problem is fixable, maybe it's not terrible, but the feeling then is every single time the symptoms come up, it's another betrayal all over again, because it's this sense that I don't have a choice about this, and now you're inflicting this on me again. The other person says, "What do you want? It's not my fault.
So every time it happens, right? So every time it happens, it's a reminder of what was not of the original betrayal, and then that keeps festering.
Right. In Talmudic language, you'd say matzah minas nino v'chozer v'neir. You can have an unkosher substance that'll be batal, but if it gets reintroduced, it takes on a new life again. Right. And I think the metaphor is very apt here when it comes to feelings. Another even more, I think, subtle but important point is the barrier that any dark secret creates. So perhaps somebody had some kind of mild sexual experiences, and they asked the rabbi, and the rabbi stroked the beard very longly and said something from Shulchan Aruch, which is probably halachically correct, that you don't have to tell the person. Let's say, I've heard of situations like that. I'm nobody's posek. But there's what you do, there's what's permitted, and then there's what's smart. Now, a person's carrying with them that kind of guilt and that kind of sense, maybe in very subtle ways. There's a kind of a distance or barrier, or the other spouse who might be, there's some people who are very attuned and very intuitive, and they always felt that there was something there, some dark secret or guilt. And then, when it comes out 10 years later, there's a lot of resentment about lost time and about concerns that just never were shared and worked with, that they could have been minor. A lot of awful secrets, they're like mold. If you shine some sunlight on them and they see the light of day, they kind of shrink and evaporate. But if they're left in a dark, cold place, they tend to really rot. And that often happens with dark secrets.
Right. And I would imagine then that once one secret was kept, the spouse is thinking, what else didn't they tell me? What else am I not gonna find out for another 5, 10, 15, 20 years that they're keeping from me as well? And so it really shakes, I guess, the entire foundation of the marriage.
Right. That's exactly why, like, a betrayal is different than just, a disappointment or some moderate lie. It's interesting. The shorish, betrayal in Hebrew is bagad, which is really the same shorish as a beged, a cloak, because I guess the idea in Hebrew is it's representing that you're kind of covering something up, you're disguising something and misrepresenting it. In English, betrayals, from the Latin tradere, which is like to hand over, it's more like to give over something false. And I think, in a way, I think that the Hebrew is cutting deeper, because it's saying, even if you don't do anything actively, even if you don't cheat the person actively, if you misrepresent yourself, if you're not who you're supposed to be, that already is the begida, that is the betrayal, right there.
I didn't say Dvar Torah in the beginning, so you mentioned beged. It says that a person is supposed to check their begodim before Shabbos. And I saw a commentary once that one should check, before Shabbos, to think, what did I, was I involved in any betrayals during this week? Was there something that I did that I was misrepresenting myself to anyone? How much more so to one's spouse? And so that's sort of a deeper understanding of checking your garments prior to Shabbos, is checking to see, is there anything here that could fester if I don't shine that light on it?
That's fascinating, because in the times of the Mishnah, the Amoratzim, who are now trusted on Meiser during the week, on Shabbos they were trusted because they never would lie on Shabbos. What else they would do, I don't know, but they would never lie on Shabbos, so you can have demai on Shabbos. So I guess it's the same idea, that there's a deep Jewish tradition that you clean up your accounts by the time Shabbos comes around. Fascinating.
Right. Yeah, and of course, I mean, if God forbid there is a betrayal, I mean, as we've seen throughout history, it's always the cover-up that really creates the biggest issue. And so,
yes,
obviously one has to be smart about how to, let somebody know about a betrayal, and it might be through what we call one of our first supporters that would approach a Rav, or approach their Kala teacher, or their Rebbe, or their Mashpia, or someone who they trust, and say, listen, I'm in a pickle here. Like, what do I do? How do I go about doing this? And I'm just thinking, as a Rav, somebody comes to me to tell me this. I mean, I remember a situation, and this is really, I think, very telling. I think something that everybody should keep in mind. I remember getting a call once from a member of the Jewish community, not a member of my shul, but a member of the Jewish community, very well-respected member of the community. And I don't know why, but as soon as I heard his voice, I immediately thought to myself, this man had an affair. I have no idea. I'm not the most intuitive person. And indeed he had. Luckily, he told his wife, and so I was never in that situation. And his wife didn't really want my involvement with her about it, so I really just dealt with him.
Mm-hmm.
But if there were 100 people in a room, and I was told 99 people had not been faithful to their spouse, he would have been the one I would have said was faithful.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
Wow.
I mean, he was a really upstanding, good, person in the community. So there is no way of knowing what is going on in people's lives, and how we respond to the person if they come to us for help, I think is really, really crucial to help them sort of sort out what is the next move.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, there's so many things I want to get to. So what would you say, let's say, to our, to a first supporter, to a Rav or a teacher or a mashpia, or like, so what do? Somebody comes to you and says, just lets out this deep dark secret. What is how do we respond, and how don't we respond?
Fair questions. So first of all, don't panic. That's a really important point. It's overwhelming, sometimes to hear. Also, it really depends on the nature of the offense. Even in adultery, there are oftentimes all kinds of very different ways that it plays out, and also they represent different types of problems and different types of behaviors. But the point is that sometimes you can hear things that are quite sordid. You could hear about, interfamilial incest and really many other very disturbing things. The first thing is really not to panic, because I think many first supporters have a role of the problem solver, the hero. Maybe even some of them had that role in their families, and that's kind of how they ended up in that position in life, as all of us are influenced often by our early roles in our family. And it does take a very special personality to be either it's a Rebbe or a Shiliach or a Mashgiach or whatever it is. And the point is that something like this, I think, because there's this sense that you need to fix it, because you fix everything else, you decide whether the chicken is kosher or treif, so to speak. This is not something that's a quick fix. And I think the important thing is really not to panic, just to understand that a lot of people made a big mess before you ever got on the scene. And long after you leave the scene, they probably will continue happily or unhappily making messes. So you do your best, and you will do your best and try to do the right thing, but it really isn't your responsibility. And it's a very important point, I think, to keep in mind. Is some problems are just very big. Having said that, I think what's important also is to, by the way, I'm not seeing movement on your side. So the enemy of Zoom, you can't tell if the person's deep in thought or they're frozen.
I'm here. I'm with you.
No, I'm not frozen. I'm deep in thought. But anyway, so I think another very important point is to understand that there are a lot of misconceptions, about affairs, and many of them are misconceptions. For example, despite what people will say and do, so to speak, Be'id and Rischa, when they're very upset, and that's very understandable that people would be upset, affairs don't usually destroy marriages in and of themselves. That's not what the statistics show. I'm not aware of specific research in the frum community, whether that becomes a game changer or not. So I'll give that proviso, but most things that happen in the regular world happen in the frum community, and the other way around too. So chances are that it probably follows similar patterns of human nature. People that have chosen to be married, there are forces that compel them, some out of love, some out of guilt, some out of loyalty, but the chances are that those forces will eventually readjust and come back into place. That is usually not what kills the marriage, the affair itself. There may be behaviors that are behind the affair, different depending on what the affair is about and the personalities involved, that might be a killer to the marriage, but they might have killed the marriage even if there wasn't an affair. Right. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind, that even though this can be very epic in a certain sense, really, really dramatic, and it is, and people will say and do a lot in their moments of great pain and betrayal. And I wouldn't try to dissuade them much, because people aren't going to hear it.
Definitely a death that has occurred.
Yes, because a death of a certain lifestyle, death of a certain belief of how things were. I think it's important just to not panic and understand that if all goes well and there are overall, strengths and functionality in this relationship, it will have a decent chance of getting back to the way that it was. And that to encourage that people be honest with their feelings and say true to their feelings and not try to convince themselves otherwise or wipe it under the rug, but do the best they can to stay away from action. That there's a difference between being very open with yourself and honest about your anger, and taking any major actions that are irreversible in decisions. That doesn't, have to happen. But so that's another main point. There are so many different kinds of betrayals, and even within infidelity, there are different kinds of infidelity, that it's very easy to just jump into certain kinds of tropes. I think in particular in the frum community, because it's so mind-boggling to think of somebody doing something that's just bad or selfish or narcissistic, that it's sometimes a lot more palatable to see them as diseased. They have an addiction. They might. I'm not saying no, but I'm saying there are plenty of people that commit, infidelity and look at pornography, or many other things, that they're not addicts. They might have other, not particularly admirable personality qualities, but they're not addicts.
Not an
and
addiction. It's a vice of sorts, but it's not an addiction.
But there's a huge difference, because an addiction, although in certain ways it's hard to define, there's no PCR test for an addiction. If a PCR test were helpful in any case, right? Which is dubious. But if one believes that it is, there isn't one for addiction. So the point is that a lot of it's subjective, but it's a very easy narrative. And it has implications because, first of all, you might not be dealing with a real issue, which is in and itself harmful. And also, people can be sent off to rehab or put in all kinds of things they don't belong. Even, for example, if someone, let's say somebody does not have an addiction and they're looking at pornography, or they have some kind of compulsive sexual behavior. If they go to certain 12-step groups where those individuals, they've been going to prostitutes, they've been having multiple affairs, I don't know if they even belong in that group. It's problematic. On the one hand, they even might have some kind of compulsive, sexual disorder. And on the other hand, like, does some guy that was looking at pornography online, does he belong in the same group with the guy that was going to the massage parlors? If you'll excuse me, I hope I can speak frankly here. So like this is very complicated. But even so, many, infidelities happen for other reasons that don't have to do with having sexual addictions at all. And that they have their own shape. I don't know how far we want to go into that, because maybe you want to talk about
I don't know
dynamics.
that's really what we want to get into. And also, I just want to mention, we are not talking about addictions, although that is certainly a betrayal. But it's I guess it's we're going to have a different talk on that, down the road. That we're not really going to get into the addictions. We really want to get into people who are on, for lack of a better term, somewhere on the bell curve. Without bringing addiction into it. So, there's so many what ifs and so many scenarios, but I'm just thinking of one. Okay, so let's say I'm not sure what is the PC word for the person who is perpetrating this? Can we say the perpetrator of this?
The committer?
The committer. Okay. So let's say the committer comes to the first supporter and tells them their dark secret, and then says, "And don't tell my spouse." What do we do?
Well, there's a lot of ways that could play out, and some of them are halachic, so I'm not going to offer an opinion. Like, for example, if one spouse discloses, let's say, to this first supporter that they're sexually active outside of marriage, there are real health dangers implied in that.
Absolutely.
So now you're carrying a secret that actually has, aside from emotional damage, some very serious ones. So I myself wonder exactly how that gets parsed halachically. and what types of confidences. So I think as a rule, when someone says to you, and this is true no matter who you're talking to, it's a very important rule for any type of first supporter professional. If somebody says, there's something I need to tell you, but you absolutely cannot tell anybody. And of course, there's a very strong urge to give a reassuring, please tell me what's on your heart, my son or my taftarol, don't say that I treat very seriously your confidence. There are some things that it might actually not be appropriate to keep your confidence. If you told me you were abusing a child, for example, I would not be at liberty for all kinds of reasons, legally and probably halachically as well. So you could say something like, I'm very interested in honoring your dignity and your privacy, and that's a very serious matter. However, you do need to know if you tell me something that does seem, for whatever reason, according to the dictates of my conscience, according to the values of what I do, if I'm a professional, I'm speaking, I might not be able to keep that confidence. I think that's an important thing to start out with. Leaving that alone, we could talk about the whole issue of disclosure, because disclosure of infidelity, there's not really a hard and fast rule over there. It's a very big challenge. Certainly, disclosures should not be done. Let's start with what should not be done. Disclosure should not just be done off the bat. If there is some kind of infidelity, especially, so to speak, a milsa davidi legluye, something that really will eventually come out, some financial issue or other things, there needs to be a lot of support in place. And usually that means probably the husband and wife have to be in some kind of counseling together for a period of time, and each of the spouses need to be in their own individual work as well. Now, people don't know me, probably they don't know me anyway. I'm not one of these people that prescribe therapy every 5 seconds for everybody. And certainly, my personal alarm bells go off when we start recommending 19 different things. But in a situation like this, initially, there's a lot of support that needs to be in place if you're going to do a disclosure, because you just don't know how it's going to play out. And the relationship as a whole needs that kind of support, and the individuals, might need somebody in their corner as well. Now, there are situations where your disclosure already happens, so then you have a different story. Then you have to deal with it. It already happened. Somebody found out, they discovered, and now once somebody knows half the story, they might want to know the whole story. Now, if I were counseling that couple, I would, with great respect and deference for this betrayed spouse, wish to know everything right now, I would ask. I think encourage is a little too strong, because I wouldn't have the insensitivity to encourage anybody in a crisis to do anything that runs against their grain. But I would ask, would they consider waiting to hear some of the details until we have established a little stronger working groove, because it can be very hard to hear all of this. But again, I think if the person felt, no, I'm not walking out of here until I hear everything, after that, we'll pick up the pieces. If it's clear that that's what the person really wants, I don't think there's much of a choice. I mean, the other person has a right to decline, but it probably would spell the end of the relationship, at least temporarily, until some further action is taken. So I think disclosures are extremely important. They have to be handled well, and not always does the person have to disclose. It's a tough one. There are certain types of infidelities that are really one-time deals. I'm not trying to minimize it. And it may be at the time very difficult to differentiate whether this person truly has some very serious problems, or they actually were in an unusual situation and they were tested or unusually weak. But it really is true. Not everything is a psychological diagnosis. There is something called the good old-fashioned Yetzer Hara. And once in a while, it's got nothing to do with the diagnosis, believe it or not, even in the 21st century. So there's the issue, and that might take work. That person might really need to actually work with a therapist to try to determine what this is all about and how this came to be. But it does happen. Even, the greatest bugaboo of our time, right? There's almost no taboo left except for pedophilia. The research shows that although, of course, there are serial pedophiles that go on to molest hundreds, there are people that are one-time deals. That doesn't make it okay. I'm not minimizing it, but the treatment process is obviously very different.
Very different, sure.
Correct. And knowing the difference between the two is part of the experience in and the differential diagnosis. But the point I'm trying to make is, so somebody, let's say, who did have a one-time kind of affair, man or woman, it is a very big question whether or not they should disclose. Now, if they don't disclose and they're able to deal with their problem, on the one hand, that's a happy solution. On the other hand, sometimes it still creates such a barrier between two people because of the guilt and the missing pieces. It becomes a very difficult, loss-benefit ratio equation. And then there's the added complexity that sometimes the greatest safety measure against not committing an infidelity in the future by someone who, for whatever reason, has been tested, is to be held accountable. But is that fair for the other spouse? Because you want to be held accountable. So there are, I think, complex ethical and psychological issues.
Right. And again, I believe that this is above the pay grade of the first supporter.
Right. I'm only speaking about it so the first supporter understand that, in essence, probably the most important rule is there's no hard and fast rule. Right. The important thing is that there does need to be a lot of clinical expertise being directed toward the situation, because the more experience that the clinicians have with these kinds of things, the more couples they've worked with in this kind of situation, the greater the depth and the ability is to really see the differences. Like koch te'tera adif, the more you know in the halach, the more you're able to see the fine distinctions here. And there are some situations that are outright, sex addicts, and others that are blurry, and others that have nothing to do with sex addiction and are more of a narcissistic, quality, and others for other reasons.
Right. And so really, I guess one of the most important things I think that we can all take away from tonight is the need to have the proper support in place, making sure that we have good people, not just, I happen to know a psychologist, or but it has to be somebody who really understands the situation and can be a support, and also can help create a team that will support this couple through their journey.
Yeah, every therapist should adopt a rabbi, and every rabbi should adopt a therapist. And I mean that, meaning to say, like, you need a go-to person who you really trust, who you could confer back and forth when it comes to issues like this, because they're multifaceted. Right.
And again, a person's specialty in one element of psychology or social work, they may not have that in something else. And hopefully they have the humility to say, hey, this is not really where my specialty lies, but I can tell you someone who does specialize in this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's also really important. So I think that, yes, that making sure the first supporter is there to try and guide the committer and the couple to some type of holistic support, and people that really know how to deal with this, so that hopefully the marriage can remain intact if indeed that's what they want.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Is there, just to flesh this out a little bit, is there a difference if it's the wife or the husband who is committing this?
There are some statistical differences. I'm not so sure if that's really important, especially it seems with every decade, a lot of the sexual differences are evaporating, I think, because in our culture, there's so much more openness and promiscuity. So like when I started my practice, women with porn addiction was, virtually unheard of. And now there are plenty of women with porn addiction as well. And there is research to show that, like, there's somewhat less female infidelity than male infidelity, but that it's catching up at a rapid rate. But I think that culturally, and you can't escape to some extent cultural definitions, culturally, I think there's a different feeling for many people between men and women, correctly or incorrectly. And, also because the halacha views infidelity by men differently than women. Although, I think it's important to say, in case more lay people are listening, like in the big picture, the halacha doesn't care whether it's only a lav, or it's an issa drabanan, or it's a chiyuv kares. There's living al pi Torah and not living al pi Torah. There's being far from Hashem and close to Hashem. So the fact that there are legal distinctions might have to do with the nature of law and what the overall picture of law as halacha is trying to accomplish in defining the marriage bond, and in helping culture define the different roles of men and women. But so the halacha will make people think in some way, oh, it's not as bad for a man, or men will play around or whatever. So I think that might affect different people's perceptions and their ability to rationalize. I'm not so sure if ultimately in the bond of marriage and the intimacy of it, it really makes much of a difference.
Right. And perhaps that would be a psak din coming from the Yetzer Hara, basically.
Thank you.
And rationalize or justify. Just thinking and trying to put myself in the place of a spouse who has been betrayed. And again, whether it's infidelity or it's in financial or in any, I guess there must be a feeling of embarrassment, of shame, of loneliness. What are some of the typical reactions that the betrayed spouse is feeling? Again, obviously everybody's different, but what are some of the classic responses?
I think that's a really good question, and of course there's no rule book or guidebook, but I think that when it's something that's not like sexual, I think in some ways it's felt less, it doesn't activate the person's insecurities. So that whole piece of my good enough spouse, is this my fault that I caused this, is much less there. So there's much more just anger and recrimination. And that's pretty, that can be pretty awful for both people going through that, but that's the reality of it. If you found out somebody just gambled away all of your chasna money, you're not really going to think, is this my fault? Was I a good enough spouse? You're only going to think that person is probably one of the worst and most devious people you've ever met. So that's a real problem. But there are other reactions that people have, I think, more around sexual infidelity, which is it's a mixture, because there is like a certain shame that you're not good enough. And then there's this kind of, anger about it, and then this shame about the anger and anger about the shame. And I'm not kidding when I say that. I think they become very complex. I think you then maybe go through phases. There could be these phases. We're gonna make it through this. We're gonna stand by each other. We'll get through this. Well, this is just an nisayon, and people make mistakes, and we're gonna go on. And then a day later, the person might totally flip and say, I don't want to ever see this person again. And I think the first supportive role in a lot of that might be just to kind of normalize and say, you might have a lot of different conflicting feelings over the next few weeks to months, and that's okay. It's too big a thing to digest in one shot. So there's denial, there's bargaining, there's you're saying
that listening ear.
Yes, yeah, to some extent, and to I think inject optimism, but not to the point of invalidation. To simply say that it's awful and all that, and yet there are opportunities to repair and recover, and others have gone down that road, and that you'll have to see what'll happen for you. However, it doesn't mean that all is lost. Even some people feel losing $50,000, $100,000, or whatever it is, they feel it's the end of the world. I know it's not easy if that's all that you have. And on the other hand, ultimately, in the picture of life, there's plenty of times people make that money over and over again, and other things happen. I think like shidduch betrayal, like secrets that are found out that you didn't want, those also are, I think they lead to doubting the validity of the marriage, maybe even more than affairs, because it's almost like, or it is mekach tos. It's like the whole, I didn't marry this person. I married somebody
Not
else.
what I signed up for.
Yeah. It's one thing if somebody has an affair, that's, so to speak, that's not Lama Freya. That's happening right now. This is, I didn't even marry the right person.
Right.
And so in some ways it even could be worse. And I think giving room for the fact that people might need to really consider and have that option that they didn't marry that person, and might have to consider, whether or not it's going to be kimu v'kiblu alayim, kimu masha kiblu kfar, or it's not. Kafalim hakagigas. These are real patterns in life. Maybe it's too much to bear, but the person needs the freedom, I think, to experience those feelings.
Yeah, it's something which my wife and I do just work with couples in Shalom Bayis. We do some Shalom Bayis workshops, and my wife uses the term to try on feelings. And people will try on all kinds of feelings. They don't necessarily mean it. They may mean it at the moment, but they don't necessarily mean it long term. And again, having that calm presence in front of them, hearing them out, hearing them try on those feelings, and like you said, the next day they could flip and be 180 degrees from where they were the day before. But just giving them that space to do that can be incredibly healing.
Yes, I do agree, and I think that there's no way to know how ultimately it might land. But people having that permission to to go in any direction is very good, very helpful.
Right. So what would you say? We're 45 minutes in. Okay, we still have some time. So what would you say would be the top 5 things the first supporter should not say or do?
That's an interesting question. I never thought of it that way. Let me let me try to think that one through. Well, I think they should. I'll be a little more poetic in terms of my answers. It's not only a matter of what they should say or do, it's a matter of what they should imply. I don't think the person should imply that they know the whole story, or even that the whole story will come out immediately. No matter what's being disclosed, there may be much more, for better or for worse. I think that's important to not imply that we've by far reached the full end of this. This is the beginning of a discussion that likely is going to take some time and growth to get through. I think what you can and should say is that you have to find the right way and time to deliver this, but it is absolutely true that ultimately you know that everything is really an opportunity, and that whatever's going on over here, there is some truth to know. No, you can't use that as an excuse to not deal with your problems, but potentially what was repaired can be much stronger than what was originally broken. Potentially, but not to the point of naivete. So, one has to be careful to giving false reassurances, but it might be appropriate at certain times to point out that people can, get repaired. Obviously, refrain from diagnoses. I would say probably refrain from committing to any course of action, no matter what's being asked. Give yourself some time to think. It's probably too heavy for any one person to digest, and to encourage the same, to say that whatever you believe or you feel right now, as powerful as it is and as compelling as it is, you might want to take a day or two to sleep on it, to think on it, maybe even to talk. I would say keep your circle tight, because too many cooks spoil the broth, but maybe to speak to 1 or 2 other trusted people, depending on what's going on. So I think those are some thoughts. I did want to talk about trust for a minute, unless you have something on your agenda.
No, absolutely.
So one of the big questions is, how do you restore trust? And it's a difficult question, because there are certain things in life that you cannot create directly. In fact, most of the really important things, like faith, love, children, there's nothing we actually could do that will that will make them happen. We only could do things that make the ground fertile for the miracle of it to happen. You can water something and you could give it sunlight and make conditions hospitable for it to develop. And love and trust and faith and even the very act of procreation really depends on a third party, on a miracle to happen to make that. But we do things to help. So first of all, nobody's going to give you trust. And, trust will slowly grow. And that it's a non-linear process. There'll be a lot of ups and downs. There'll be things that will trigger and cause, the trust to be shaken again, sometimes legitimately so, that there'll be a repetition of the behavior, hopefully on a smaller scale, indicative of some kind of progression and healing, but still there could be that, or there could be false alarms that are also, equally troubling, or the whole thing all over again, which, makes you wonder whether you should continue to trust the person, which is a valid question. But I'm saying that you have to be realistic, that we can do things that will create trust, which is a certain kind of transparency and knowing and getting close and feeling so close that, and this will take time, maybe years, that, no one can know anybody fully, but you feel confident enough in what's really going on between the two of you that you'd be shocked to discover if there was, something you didn't know about. I think spouses, especially if they're dealing with addicts, get trapped into, being police people and checking their phones and checking their email. And I would like to say officially that, to my knowledge, nothing good ever came from looking at somebody's cell phone or email. And even if you discovered something that in essence you feel you needed to discover, I would submit for consideration that if you were holding by wondering what was on your spouse's phone, then that's where the problem is. Either, there's signs of something wrong in the relationship that need really to be looked at, or there are some other problems. But the point is that invading somebody else's privacy to get information is not a very good way to deal with it. And I know that's very hard, especially for a spouse that has been betrayed. Very, very, very hard not to look or not to check up. But
What's the saying? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Yes, except there are other ways to not be fooled, and they don't have to do with actually, catching the smoking gun.
What would those ways be? Like, what are some of the things? What are some of the signs, I guess?
The heart knows the heart. I think people can tell whether they have a solid relationship or they don't. Although it's a hard and fast rule. I've worked with situations where really the spouse was utterly broadsided and really thought that they had the closest relationship. So I wouldn't say that it can never, happen that way. But I do think the heart does know the heart. I do think that in general, secretive behavior, mysterious behavior, odd charges, extended absences from home with odd excuses, things like that definitely do add up, right, to make you concerned. Ultimately, go ahead.
No, so if somebody approaches a first supporter and says, I think my spouse is whatever, having an affair, is up to their eyeballs in debt, is whatever, you name, whatever the betrayal might be, but I don't know for sure. So as a first supporter, you're not a detective, you're not a PI. Mm-hmm. What do you, and I obviously these are general questions in very specific situations, and it's hard, like you said, there's no hard fast rules, but so what are some of the responses? Like what do you do with that?
If your gut tells you there's something wrong in the marriage, I think the important thing is to confront your spouse and say that I'm left with a very strong feeling that there's something that's not okay here. I'm not the police. I'm not interested in being the police, but I am interested in having the best marriage we can have. So are you willing to start engaging in the process of improving our marriage and figuring out other things that we need to talk out and work through that we haven't. It's
And
just
as a
what it
first
is.
supporter, would a first supporter actually act as a go-between? Would that?
I don't
sense?
recommend that. No, I think that's a morass. It's very hard to get out of. First of all, you don't know if the accusations are true or not, and now you're, the religious authority and getting involved too and making accusations.
Right.
So I would say it's not a bright idea. I think what you want to counsel is patience and wisdom, and honesty, and to say, look, trying to force information and get information, having your curiosity satisfied on the one hand, definitely could relieve you of a lot of anxiety, but it ultimately is not what's going to save your marriage. So you have to decide. If you're so suspicious that you think you were betrayed and your main point is to catch your spouse red-handed, shame them and force them to divorce you or something like that, well then I guess if it's war, it's war. Do what you need to do. Hire a PI. Do what you got to do. But if your main point is to actually have a relationship, then there's no halfways in relationships, and you have to relate. Then you have to show some degree of respect and compassion and reach out to the other side and try to work it out. And if it doesn't work, it's no different than any other marriage problem that doesn't work. It's not working. You have to figure out what that means, and if that resistance itself is addressable or not.
So in that respect, really, sort of healing. There's one of the Hayom Yoms where the Rebbe talks about two types of healing. One is where you heal that which is afflicted, and the other is you strengthen all of the supporting parts around it to try and give it some healing through strengthening everything else. So by strengthening the marriage, by strengthening communication, things like that, and by taking an active role, the spouse goes and says, I feel like there's something that is between us. Would you go with me to a therapist? Could we see somebody, or a Rav, or somebody, just to start learning how to relate better, instead of, a full frontal, you're cheating on me. Or
yeah, I do want to stress
whatever.
though, that I'm not suggesting some kind of like naive cover it all up and it'll go away approach. I think, again, there might be a point that it is very important for there to be a disclosure. I'm simply saying that if the goal is to save the marriage, then you work on the marriage, and you start in a way, in whatever way that's respectful and collaborative to work on the marriage. If you want to blow something apart and you're on a rampage, and I'm not judging anybody, if you're betrayed and you want to do that, but that's not necessarily going to fix anything. No,
Right.
once in a while,
Understand the ramifications.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's simply, it becomes very intense, and there isn't enough strength in the relationship to even deal with it.
Right. We're sort of getting close to the end of the hour. I don't see if there are any questions. I don't see any here. So again, a spouse comes to the first supporter and says, I know for a fact that my spouse has betrayed me in whatever fashion it might be.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a scenario? Well, I guess I sort of asked this, but is there a scenario where, let's say once it's out in the open, or at any point where you reach out to the committor? If they haven't approached you, are you proactive?
So it's an interesting question. It's hard for me to think from the point of view of the Rav, because on the one hand, a rabbi's boundaries are different. The spiritual life of their congregants are really their business on one level. And so you could kind of make the argument that why not check in and say, hey, Yankel, I hear there might be some things going on. You want to talk to me about it? Maybe, but it's such a morass. I would simply encourage the spouse to confront their spouse, obviously after some little counseling, a little work, to try to make things, to try to establish some kind of working relationship, and to make your presence known, that you're here to support both of them, to offer spiritual guidance in the middle of this. You can't replace a therapist at all. These are things that are beyond just simply Musar and Isavata, but you are here for the spiritual component. And if in a non-contentious way, you're not here to mediate some contentious fight, it's not your role, you're to argue, but if your advice is sought, you'd love to help in different ways.
Right. So reaching out and saying, listen, I know your family's going through a hard time. I just want you to know that I'm here for you. If I can be of any help, or if you'd like to, a confidential ear or something like that, that would be appropriate, or you think that works?
I don't see any harm with it.
Right.
It's just it's hard sometimes for me to think from a, like, so to speak, pulpit rabbi's hat when I'm wearing a therapist act. A therapist would probably not do that under most circumstances because it's considered intrusive. But it is
Right.
different. The contract with the rabbi is different, and you could argue it's even a dereliction of duty to not, in some way, at least mildly, say, I know stuff's going on. I'm not here to beat up on you. Just if you want to talk about it, like, we can talk about it.
Right. And again, I'm coming from a rough perspective, but I mean, a college teacher, I don't know if that would work, but because of or Rebbe, maybe, I don't know. Like, in other words, if the wife is the one who comes to her college teacher and says that her husband has betrayed her, for that college teacher to contact the husband, I don't really necessarily see that as making a whole lot of sense.
It's not usually done, I would imagine.
Yeah. But a Rov would do something like that. Yeah. Okay.
It looked like there was one question. I kind of floated on the screen.
Let's see.
I couldn't see it.
So as a trauma healing facilitator, what is my role when someone says they were abusing a child? And that's really not the purview of tonight. I'm not going to go out on a limb to say that really needs to be reported. I don't know that there's any other thing to do.
Yeah, I don't want to comment on that because there are it could be all kinds of legal implications, and each profession also has its own reporting requirements.
Right.
But that's a very first supporters that learn of a child that was abused or is actively being abused, but even was abused. They really need to get the most professional legal and clinical advice, because it is, and for that matter, halachic advice, because you have an issue of al-samar adam re'echa. But it's complicated. Right. What if it was occurred 10 years ago and nobody remembers? I'm not getting into the legalities of it. I'm talking about just trying to imagine the halachas of it. So you need to remind somebody, by the way, I abused you 10 years ago, in case you have repressed memories. I mean, these are very complex questions.
Right. And again, Rabbanim, thankfully, are being much more open about this. So yes, I will withhold or retract whatever I may have said that might be held against me. I'm not going to. Yes, I mean.
Yeah, frankly, it's extremely complicated. There's so many different scenarios that are so complicated. You really need legal, halachic, and clinical people all in the same room to figure out in certain situations what even to do.
Yes, but the abuse needs to stop. I mean, that's there's no.
Well, if it's ongoing, it's not such a big question. If it's ongoing, it stops right now when a report is made. I could live with saying that pretty clearly.
Yeah.
but there are many other more complex situations.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, and I guess, I guess the just to end off maybe on a more positive note, despite the difficult conversation that we're having, is what you as a first responder, obviously, like you said, not to sweep things under the rug and not to poo-poo it, but at the same time to also give some element of hope to the person or to the couple that is going through this. Because obviously, if the committor understands the depth of the betrayal, then their shame and their guilt is beyond. And so,
yes,
finding the words to try and support them through this, and if they indeed want to keep the marriage intact, what are some of the things that can be said by a first supporter, again remembering that you as the first supporter are not supplanting the therapist and the other members of the support team.
who are we talking to the committer or to the person who is the victim of the infidelity?
Why don't we talk about each individually, and then as a couple, if they come into your office to talk to you?
Well, like I said, as a couple, the overall message is that this is a very serious challenge, and that it's unknown at this point yet what will be the right path and the path toward healing. However, it is a statistical fact that marriages do heal from affairs and other betrayals, and that there's reason to be hopeful. Not naively optimistic, but hopeful. But a lot of important steps have to be made. In terms of the person who is, the victim, just to say that you're going to feel a lot of different things, many contradictory things, and it'll probably take you a while to come back to some sense of even confidence in yourself. Forget about, trust in the marriage, and that's okay. Just try not to make any major decisions during this time of turmoil, and seek out some help and support for yourself. Even though you might argue that, why do you need therapy? You didn't do anything wrong, and that might very well be true. There are just some things that are too hard to go through without having some kind of objective support and insight. And you go to family members, but family members are oftentimes biased in all kinds of ways, and they mean well, but in certain circumstances, you need something that's above the fray. So that's what I would say to the person who was the victim, so to speak. And I think the one who committed, I would say that obviously your blood is as red as mine, and there is probably nothing and no kind of awful trouble that any human being isn't capable of getting into. Unfortunately, as humans are capable of doing the greatest and most sublime and beautiful things, they're capable of the opposite, and all of us are. Right now, you happen to be on the other side of this desk, but the reality is that all of us are capable. So this is the reality, and what's important to understand is that there's a lot that it's not. The past is the past. There's absolutely nothing you can do about the past. What makes a difference in life is what you do next. And there's a lot of good moves that you can make, and a lot of not so good moves you can make. And you need to think to yourself, what is the next right move over here? And even if you are carrying a lot of pain yourself, and you might be, because there's certain circumstances where that's a part of this whole mixture, and you might feel very aggrieved too, you do have to consider that sometimes when something's really tangled up, you have to untie the first knot first, and you can't get to the bottom knot, even if the bottom knot is worse. And you are going to have to deal with your spouse's pain, and you're going to have to empathize and validate for quite a while. And it may be quite a while before, if you believe there are underlying issues and underlying injustices that you are aggrieved about, it might be quite a while before you're able to have that heard and understood. But you need to know that there is a certain reality to this, that maybe somebody handed you a loaded gun, but you pulled the trigger, and now you're the ones going to jail. And you're going to need to first recover from that and help your spouse recover before you go into what are your issues in the marriage or whatever that might be there legitimately.
Well, Simcha, thank you so much. I guess, is there a closing statement you'd like to make, or something that you really want to make sure that we as first supporters take away from tonight?
Don't panic. Don't give up. And people are amazing, and that they're capable of anything wonderful and awful.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Simcha, thank you once again. Wish you a Freilichen Purim, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And